Take that hood off, son. This isn't a rap video. That was the first thing Judge Harold Wexler said, his voice laced with disdain, the moment 17-year-old Jalen Prescott walked into courtroom 2B at the Maricopa County Courthouse in Phoenix, Arizona. The place was already half full, a low hum of murmurs and whispers punctuated by quiet laughter. A few folks looked up from their phones, a bored indifference on their faces. The bailiff, a burly man with a perpetually tired expression, tried hard not to smirk, his lips twitching at the corners. Jalen, however, didn't flinch. He calmly took the hood down, revealing short, twisted hair and sharp, dark eyes that didn't blink much, taking in the sterile room, the faces, the silent judgment. His clothes were plain, almost unremarkable, a faded grey hoodie, black jeans, scuffed-up sneakers with frayed laces. If you didn't know better, you'd think he was here for a truancy hearing, a minor infraction in a long line of them. But he wasn't. He walked straight to the plaintiff's table, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He dropped his worn backpack beside the chair and sat down like he'd been doing this every Monday since Christmas, a quiet confidence settling around him that seemed utterly out of place. Across from him sat the defense attorney, a man in his mid-40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit. His silver-rimmed glasses never slipped, perched perfectly on his nose, and a smug look on his face screamed, "This won't take long." He glanced at Jalen, then at the judge, a faint, condescending smile playing on his lips. Judge Wexler, now visibly annoyed by the teenager's serene demeanor, leaned forward from the bench, his brows furrowed. He raised an eyebrow, a clear signal of his impatience. "Are you lost, Mr. Prescott?" "Jalen Prescott. I'm here representing my cousin, Ms. Tiana Rowe, in her civil claim, case number 2023 CV7. Jalen's voice was clear, steady, cutting through the low hum of the courtroom. The room got quieter, the murmurs dying down. "You're what now?" Wexler asked, his voice rising slightly, a hint of incredulity creeping in. "I am her legal representative pro se appointment. All documents were submitted and approved last Friday." Jalen calmly reached into his backpack, pulled out a neatly clipped file, and held it up. The bailiff, still side-eyeing him, walked it to the bench, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Wexler adjusted his glasses, a slow, deliberate movement, and flipped through the papers. He scanned the contents, his eyes moving quickly over the official stamps and signatures. Approved. Judge's signature and all that. That should have been the end of it, the moment the courtroom accepted the unusual circumstance. But it wasn't. "All right," Wexler sighed, setting the file aside with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "We're doing circus acts now, are we? Sure, you watch a few episodes of Law and Order and now you're Clarence Darrow. Fine, let's pretend this isn't absurd." The audience chuckled again, a low, sharp sound that pricked at the edges of the quiet. A few heads shook in disbelief, an older woman in the back row whispered something to her neighbor, and they both chuckled, their eyes fixed on the spectacle before them. Still, Jalen didn't bite. He just opened his own case file, its worn cover contrasting with the polished veneer of the courtroom, flipped a few pages, and scribbled something on a yellow notepad. The defense attorney stood, clearing his throat, his confidence seemingly undiminished. "Your Honor, we're happy to proceed, but for the record, we reserve the right to request a dismissal based on the plaintiff's decision to be represented by a minor." He paused, a smug look returning to his face, as if that would be the final word. Judge Wexler waved that off with a half-laugh, a dismissive gesture. Let the boy make a fool of himself. He wanted the spotlight. Let's see what he does with it. That's when Jalen looked up, for the first time since taking his seat. His gaze, calm and unwavering, settled on the defense attorney, then flickered to the judge. With a composure that didn't match his age, he asked, "Before we proceed, Your Honor, may I verify that opposing counsel has disclosed all documentation related to the February 8th lease violation? The emails, photos, time-stamped notices." The room stilled again, the air growing heavy with anticipation. Wexler blinked, caught off guard. The defense attorney hesitated, a subtle shift in his posture, a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. Those weren't included in initial discovery due to timing issues, so they were omitted." He tried to sound casual, but the words hung in the air, revealing a clear omission. Jaylen cut in, his voice precise. Despite being material to the central claim. Wexler looked between them, his gaze sharp, suddenly assessing the defense attorney with a frown. The lawyer straightened his tie, visibly uncomfortable. "I'll allow a 5-minute recess for you to produce the missing documentation," Wexler muttered, his tone now edged with annoyance. "Don't make a habit of cutting corners." Jaylen sat back, nodded once, a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture of victory, and wrote something else down on his notepad. He hadn't even started his argument, but the courtroom already felt different. The silence that followed wasn't boredom, it was curiosity, tinged with a nascent respect. But Wexler wasn't done testing him, and Jaylen, with his quiet intensity, hadn't even warmed up. Jaylen was born in South Phoenix, just about 10 blocks from where his cousin Tiana's apartment complex now stood, half boarded up, with paint peeling off the side walls and broken mailboxes zip-tied shut. It wasn't the kind of place where people talked about civil court, not in the everyday chatter. But his mother, Patrice, she did. She'd worked the front desk at a pediatric clinic for 16 years and never once missed a shift. She knew how to stretch a dollar like it was dough, making every cent count. She knew exactly how many hours you had to work, relentlessly, to keep the lights on, the fridge running, and the rent paid 3 days early so the landlord wouldn't come sniffing around, looking for an excuse. His father, he left when Jaylen was 5. Left a stack of bills and a half-packed suitcase, and that was the last anyone saw of him. Jaylen wasn't bitter about it, not in the way some kids might be. He just learned early on, with a quiet, heavy certainty, that no one was coming to save them. They were on their own. He was the kind of kid who sat quietly in the back of class, hoodie up, scribbling things in the margins of his notebook. Teachers thought he wasn't paying attention, that his mind was elsewhere, lost in the chaotic currents of his neighborhood. He was, just not to them. The shift began the day his uncle got arrested over a parking violation that spiraled into a bogus resisting charge. Jaylen started reading. Not just articles, not just surface-level news. He dove into court transcripts, city ordinances, Supreme Court summaries on Google Scholar, devouring them with a fierce, growing hunger. It started with anger, a burning injustice for his uncle's unfair treatment. But then came interest, a flicker of fascination with the intricate machinery of the law. And then, obsession. By the time he was 15, he could recite parts of Arizona's tenant laws from memory, the complex clauses and sub-clauses rolling off his tongue with surprising ease. At 16, he was drafting sample responses to eviction notices, just for practice, intricate legal arguments taking shape on his worn notebook paper. On weekends, while kids from his school were at the mall or trying to sneak into clubs, Jaylen was watching public court cases online, breaking them down like a coach reviewing game tape, dissecting every move, every strategy. No one took it seriously. No one saw it as more than a quirky hobby, a phase. Except his mother. She didn't say much, her praise often subtle, expressed through quiet acts of support. But one night, while folding laundry, her hands moving rhythmically through the fabric, she looked at him, her eyes soft but unwavering. "You'd make a damn good lawyer," she said. Then she went back to matching socks, a simple act that somehow solidified everything for Jaylen. That stuck. It got real. The day Tiana came home in tears, waving a notice from her landlord, was the turning point. She was accused of breaking a lease over a noise complaint that wasn't even hers. A neighbor had filed it while Tiana was working a double shift at the hospital. Jaylen knew it smelled wrong, a rotten odor of injustice. And when she couldn't afford an attorney, with every door seemingly closing in her face, he stepped up. Not with arrogance, not with bravado, but with a quiet, unshakable determination. He dove into the work. He did the research, pulling city records, compiling timestamps, poring over security logs, and cross-referencing building policies. He even managed to get 2 affidavits from neighbors who'd overheard the property manager say, plainly, that he was trying to clear out the Section 8 people by the summer. Jaylen was 17, no license, no car, no social media presence, no official degree. But his binder was thick, stuffed with meticulously organized evidence. His argument was solid, built on undeniable facts and the clear letter of the law. He knew he had a legal right, under Arizona law, to represent a family member in civil court with proper approval. So he filed the paperwork, got it notarized, and waited. Then he showed up in court. No one expected much. But that was the thing about Jalen. He never walked into a room loud. He just let silence follow him when he left. And back in courtroom 2B, that silence was starting to feel heavy, pregnant with expectation. Judge Wexler, still clinging to his control, wasn't ready to let go, but the quiet advocate from South Phoenix was just getting started. Tiana Rowe was 24, working nights at St. Joseph's Hospital, her days consumed by caring for her little brother, Kalen, whose asthma was so severe it sometimes kept him out of school for days. She wasn't the type to cause trouble. She paid her rent on time, kept her small place meticulously clean, and didn't complain, even when the heat went out in January and she shivered through nights wrapped in extra blankets. But her building was changing. New management had swept in 6 months ago, bringing with them blueprints for modernization, and higher rent, stricter rules, and a quiet, insidious push to get rid of tenants who didn't fit their shiny new vision. The pressure started small, letters for minor violations that seemed to appear out of nowhere, random inspections at inconvenient hours, vague complaints about excessive noise from tenants who were never even home. Then came the February 8 complaint, the one that broke Tiana. A noise violation report, supposedly filed by a neighbor, detailing loud music, yelling, possible fighting. The only thing was, Tiana had clocked into work at 6:45 p.m. that night and didn't leave the hospital until after 7 the next morning. Kalen had stayed overnight with a friend. They weren't even home. She tried to contest the claim with the property manager, a slick, dismissive man named Phil Hayworth, but he shut her down. "We have the right to terminate based on repeated violations. This isn't personal." Except it was. Because 2 other families in the building, both black, single-parent households like Tiana's, had already been forced out with the same kind of vague warnings, the same official-sounding letters that masked intimidation. No hearings, no questions, just a quiet, relentless push. That's when she called Jalen. He didn't answer right away. He was in school, sneaking glances at a legal textbook he'd hidden behind his Chromebook. But when he saw the missed call and the text that followed, "They're trying to evict me by the end of the month," he left class without permission, hopped on a city bus, and showed up at her apartment by dinner. They sat at her kitchen table, bills spread out like playing cards, the faint scent of old spices and cheap detergent clinging to the air. He didn't talk much at first. He just listened, absorbing every detail, every tremor in her voice. He wrote things down, asked sharp, concise questions that made her think. Then he pulled out his worn laptop, its flickering screen a beacon in the dim room, and created a folder, Roe v. Holstead Management. He started building a case, piece by meticulous piece, emails, timestamps, shift logs, building policies, Arizona's tenant protection laws. He compiled it all. He found out the complaint wasn't signed, no witness, no audio, no written statement. Just a vague report and, more damning, an email chain between the building supervisor and the regional property director talking explicitly about revitalizing the tenant profile. He even tracked down the neighbor who supposedly filed the complaint, Ms. Cheney, apartment 3B, a retired woman with a walker and a small garden of potted plants outside her door. When he asked her about the complaint, she looked confused. "I don't even know that girl," she'd said. "I didn't write nothing. I ain't heard nothing either." That was the nail. Jalen typed up a letter of intent to dispute the violation and filed it under Tiana's name. When the property manager, arrogantly confident in his power, didn't respond, Jalen filed a civil complaint for wrongful eviction. A week later, they received a court date. When Jalen showed up with his official approval to act as a pro se representative, the clerk looked at him twice, asked for ID, verified the paperwork 3 times. It was valid. But paperwork didn't stop prejudice, and when they walked into courtroom 2B that morning, it was like everyone had already made up their mind. Jalen wasn't supposed to be there, not dressed like that, not that young, not that confident. But he didn't come to play dress up. He came to make them regret underestimating him. Still, knowing the law wasn't enough now. He had to prove he belonged in a room that was doing everything to make him feel like he didn't. "Let's keep this short," Judge Wexler said, his voice flat, as he straightened the stack of papers in front of him. We've got 3 other cases backed up already. He was already tired, not of work, but of Jalen, of the entire absurd situation. It showed in the way he sighed before speaking, in how he rolled his pen between his fingers like it was a waste of time. Mr. Prescott, you may proceed. Try not to turn this into a TED Talk. Jalen stood up. No papers in hand, just a yellow notepad and a pen tucked behind his ear. Thank you, Your Honor. Before I begin, I'd like to address the court's assumption that my presence is a novelty. Objection. The defense attorney interrupted, his voice sharp. Is this an opening statement or a personal grievance? Jalen turned his head, calm as ever. It's context. And I'll move forward. He walked slowly to the front, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom, then focusing on Wexler. This case isn't about noise. It's about power. My cousin, Tiana Rowe, is a working-class tenant in a complex that's being quietly cleared of families that don't fit a certain profile. She was accused of violating her lease while she was clocked in at St. Joseph's, 45 minutes away. No evidence, no signature, just a typed-up report. We're not asking for sympathy, Your Honor. We're asking for facts. The room was still again, a hush falling over the gallery. You could hear the faint creak of the bench as someone shifted their weight, leaning forward, suddenly captivated. Wexler scratched his chin, his expression unreadable, not amused, not impressed, just a deep, entrenched annoyance. And you've got proof of all this? He asked flatly, his voice devoid of any real expectation. I do, Jalen said, reaching into his backpack and handing a tabbed binder to the bailiff. Inside were timestamps from Tiana's time card, a sworn statement from Ms. Cheney denying the complaint, and building-wide notices showing a pattern of selective enforcement in one section. He had even printed out an internal email chain, acquired legally through a resident complaint, that showed management discussing a long-term tenant replacement strategy. Wexler flipped through the binder, his eyes scanning the meticulously organized tabs. Well organized. But you realize that evidence alone doesn't win a case, Mr. Prescott. Jalen didn't blink. Yes, Your Honor. But facts have a tendency to speak louder than sarcasm. The room shifted, a ripple of suppressed amusement. Someone in the gallery choked back a laugh. Wexler leaned back in his chair, staring at Jalen like he was sizing him up for the first time, a flicker of something new in his eyes, something akin to grudging respect. You think you're clever, don't you? Wexler murmured, almost to himself. No, Your Honor. I think my cousin deserves housing security, like anyone else. The defense attorney rose again, clearly annoyed, his jaw tight. Objection, Your Honor. His grandstanding. Overruled, Wexler muttered, his gaze still fixed on Jalen. He still didn't like the kid, not really, but he was starting to listen. Jalen continued, his voice gaining a quiet force, this time addressing the judge directly, citing the specific legal statute. In accordance with ARS Section 33 to 1367, tenants have the right to dispute retaliatory or baseless eviction threats. Ms. Rowe was not issued a formal hearing, was not given a chance to respond in writing, and received no copy of the alleged complaint. These are procedural violations that undermine her rights and place her at risk of homelessness for a noise complaint that never existed. He said that last part slowly, not dramatic, just steady, plain. Wexler didn't speak for a while. The defense attorney tried to shift focus, claiming Tiana had a history of behavioral complaints, but Jalen countered each one with documentation proving they were vague, unsupported, or flat-out false. You came prepared, Wexler said under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. Jalen didn't smile. He wasn't here for that. He just stood there, calm as ever, hands folded. But the hardest part wasn't making his case. It was surviving a system that expected him to fail from the moment he opened his mouth. The courtroom didn't feel the same anymore. What started as entertainment for some, a kid trying to be a lawyer, was now uncomfortable, quiet. People were leaning forward instead of laughing. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her gaze now fixed on Jalen with an uncharacteristic intensity. Jalen walked back to the plaintiff's table and opened his binder again, flipping straight to the back. I'd like to call my first witness, he said. Ms. Cheney, apartment 3B. The judge blinked. You brought a witness? Yes, Your Honor. She's present and willing to testify. The older woman with the walker, Ms. Cheney, stood up slowly from the gallery. She moved with care, her steps small and deliberate, but her eyes were focused, unwavering, fixed on Jaylen. He offered her an arm as she made her way to the front, a gesture of quiet respect that softened the harsh edges of the courtroom. Once seated and sworn in, Jaylen approached, his voice calm, clear, cutting through the silence. Ms. Cheney, did you file a noise complaint against Ms. Tiana Rowe on February 8? No, I did not, she said without hesitation, her voice surprisingly firm for her age. Were you asked to? Not directly, no, but the manager came by earlier that week asking questions about the younger tenants, said he was trying to clean things up. Her gaze flickered to the defense attorney, then back to Jaylen. Did you ever observe Ms. Rowe causing disturbances in the building? Never. That girl works harder than anybody in the building. And did anyone from management inform you a report had been filed in your name? No. First time I heard about it was from this young man right here. Ms. Cheney gestured towards Jaylen with a slight nod. No further questions, Jaylen said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper of triumph. The defense attorney stood up, a flicker of desperation in his eyes, but Wexler raised a hand. No need, he said quietly, his gaze fixed on Ms. Cheney. Let her rest. The room stayed still, a profound respect settling over the space as Ms. Cheney made her way back to the bench with help from the bailiff. Jaylen turned back to the judge, his voice gaining a quiet power. We also have time-stamped security footage from the hospital where Ms. Rowe works. It confirms her entry and exit on the date in question. He slid a USB across the table to the bailiff. Her supervisor also submitted a signed statement verifying her shift hours. The courtroom projector flickered to life. The screen showed a grainy hallway, the timestamp reading 6:45 p.m. Tiana walked in, hospital badge around her neck, hair pulled back, scrubs on, exhaustion already etched on her face. The next clip, 7:15 a.m., showed her exiting the same hallway, shoulders slumped, hair messy, the deep weariness of a double shift. Wexler tapped his pen slowly against his desk, the sound loud in the suddenly hushed room. The defense attorney didn't speak, he was staring at the screen, arms crossed, jaw tight, the smugness completely gone. When the footage ended, Wexler looked at Jaylen, anew, assessing quality in his gaze. Mr. Prescott, you've made your point. Jaylen didn't relax. He stood still. There's one more thing, he said. He pulled a folded letter from his pocket, unfolded it carefully, and handed it to the bailiff. It was from another tenant, Maria Estes, a single mother who'd moved out 2 months earlier after receiving 3 vague notices of lease violations. In the letter, she described the subtle intimidation, the constant letters, and how the property manager had told her, chillingly, "It's easier for everybody if you just leave." The judge read it silently, his lips pressed into a thin line. After a long pause, he leaned forward and rested his hands on the bench, his voice low, heavy with a weight that hadn't been there before. "I've been on this bench for 19 years, he said slowly, "and I've never seen a kid walk in here with this level of preparation, confidence, and evidence. Especially not without a law degree." He looked at Jaylen for a long time, then at the defense attorney. "You've got a lot to answer for," he told the lawyer, his voice sharp with thinly veiled anger. Turning back to Jaylen, he added, "Your case is compelling. More than that, it's airtight." Jaylen didn't smile. He simply nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." But this wasn't about praise, it was about the fact that no one expected him to make it this far, and yet here he stood, unshaken. The courtroom didn't clap, no one stood. This wasn't a movie. But the energy had shifted. Even the court reporter glanced at Jaylen now, with something different in her eyes, something like respect. The defense attorney, Mr. Brian Lell, stood up, finally, clutching a folder that suddenly felt thinner than it had that morning. "We'd like to motion for a short recess to review this new material," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Wexler shook his head. "You've had weeks to prepare. The footage is dated, the letter is signed. You were informed of the witnesses in the case summary. He tapped the bench with his pen. Motion denied. Continue. Lel walked slowly back to his table, flipping pages like they'd rearranged themselves. He tried again, this time pushing for dismissal based on procedural irregularities. But the judge cut him off. Irregularities like not producing the lease logs when asked. Wexler said, raising an eyebrow, his voice laced with pointed sarcasm. Silence. Jalen glanced down at his notepad, then turned to look at Tiana. She sat quietly, hands clasped in her lap, her leg bouncing under the table, a nervous energy, but her face was unreadable. He leaned over and whispered, "You okay?" She nodded. Barely. Back at the bench, Wexler cleared his throat. "Let's be honest here," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "This wasn't supposed to be a real case. Not in your mind, Mr. Lel. Not in mine either, if I'm being truthful." Lel shifted uncomfortably. "You thought you'd walk in, call the bluff, and it would be over in 15 minutes. But it turns out this young man did more homework than most third-year associates I've had in front of me." Jalen didn't react, not out of pride, but because the fight wasn't finished yet. "I'd like to call the building manager," Jalen said. "Objection." Lel snapped, clearly exasperated. He wasn't listed in the. He was subpoenaed. Responded via email. "The court has a copy of the confirmation," Jalen replied, flipping to the exact page in his binder and sliding it toward the judge. Wexler scanned it, then nodded. "He's in the hallway. Bring him in." The door opened, and in walked a stocky man in his late 30s with a clipboard and an air of belligerent attitude. His name was Phil Hayworth, and he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. He sat down, took the oath, and folded his arms, his gaze defiant. Jalen stepped up. "Mr. Hayworth, can you explain why Ms. Rowe was issued a violation for a complaint that can't be traced to any resident?" "I had a report," Phil said flatly. "From who?" I don't remember the name. It was written down." "Where is it now?" "I don't have it. Might have gotten lost." Phil fidgeted. "You filed a lease violation based on an anonymous claim with no supporting evidence. Is that correct?" Jalen pressed, his voice even, relentless. "Look, I manage over 100 tenants. Yes or no?" Phil glanced at the judge, but Wexler didn't blink. Yes." Jalen opened the binder to a printout. "Did you write this email to your regional manager on February 10th? We're going to start removing the problematic ones, starting with 2C. They won't fight it." Phil's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine fear. "That was taken out of context." "What's the context where calling tenants problems is okay?" Silence. "Do you consider working-class tenants a problem, Mr. Hayworth?" Phil looked like he wanted to disappear, his gaze darting desperately to the judge, but Wexler simply watched, unblinking. "No further questions," Jalen said, dismissing him. Phil was dismissed, and as he walked past the gallery, a few people shook their heads, Ms. Cheney staring at the floor. Back at the plaintiff's table, Jalen sat down slowly, his jaw tight now, not from nerves, but from holding everything in. The anger, the frustration, the exhaustion from staying up all night researching rental codes and legal definitions. It was finally coming out, but not in shouts, in facts. But even with the truth on your side, justice isn't guaranteed. Not until someone has the courage to make the room uncomfortable. For a full 10 seconds, no one spoke. Wexler sat perfectly still, chin resting on one hand, glasses sliding down his nose. He looked like he was seeing the courtroom differently now, like the walls had shifted while he wasn't paying attention. Jalen stayed seated, not because he was tired, but because standing wasn't necessary anymore. Everything he needed to say had been said. Tiana whispered, "What happens now?" Jalen didn't answer right away. He just looked at the judge, waiting. Wexler finally sat up straight and cleared his throat. "This court finds the complaint issued against Ms. Tiana Rowe to be without merit. The eviction process was initiated without sufficient evidence, with procedural inconsistencies, and with what this court can only describe as a troubling pattern of selective enforcement." The words hit hard, not just because they were a win, but because they were real, documented, spoken aloud on record. In addition, Wexler continued, the court recommends the matter be reviewed by the appropriate housing authority for possible violations of the Arizona Fair Housing Act. Lell tried to interject, Your Honor, if I may. You may not, Wexler replied, without looking at him. You had your chance. He turned toward Jalen now. His expression had changed. Still stern, still formal, but there was something else under it, a pause, a kind of weight behind his voice that hadn't been there before. Mr. Prescott, he said, his voice softer, I owe you an apology. Jalen tilted his head slightly, a subtle acknowledgement. When you walked into this room, I dismissed you. I saw a hoodie. I saw a teenager. I didn't see an advocate. That was my mistake. Somewhere in the back row, someone murmured, about time. Wexler didn't flinch. You have demonstrated extraordinary skill, knowledge, and self-control. You defended your family with dignity. You navigated complex legal standards with clarity, and you kept your composure under pressure most adults couldn't handle. Jalen gave a small nod. I appreciate that, he said, quiet, even. Wexler looked down at his paperwork, then back up. This court session is adjourned. The gavel struck once, a final, definitive sound. It was done. No applause, just quiet. Tiana exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for weeks, her shoulders dropping. She turned to Jalen, her eyes full but not crying. You did it. He didn't smile. He just stood up, closed his binder, and packed it into his backpack like it was just another Tuesday. Nothing flashy, nothing loud. The clerk approached him on the way out and tapped his shoulder. Hey, she said, you ever think about taking the bar one day? You've got something. Jalen gave her the same calm look he gave everyone. Maybe. If they'll let me. Outside the courthouse, the air was warmer, a stark contrast to the chilled tension within. People walked past, oblivious, as if nothing profound had just happened. Jalen and Tiana sat on the bench near the bus stop, the same one where they'd waited just a week ago to file the paperwork. She nudged him with her shoulder, her eyes still shimmering with unshed tears, but now they were tears of relief, of pure, unadulterated gratitude. Seriously, thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He nodded, fiddling with the zipper on his worn backpack, his gaze distant, lost in the quiet aftermath of the battle. Just didn't want to see you pushed out for no reason. He paused, then looked at her, a hint of something deeper in his dark eyes. But how did you even learn all that? He looked down, then back at her, a quiet vulnerability in his voice. I had to. Nobody else was going to do it. Tiana didn't say anything, just leaned back, watching the clouds move over the sun, a profound sense of awe settling over her. Jalen finally cracked a smile, not a big, flashy grin, but a real one, a subtle upward curve of his lips that hinted at the quiet satisfaction within. You hungry? I'm starving. I got $20. Then you're buying. They both laughed, not loud, but it carried a small, resonant sound that spoke volumes. Because in a system that rarely listens, one calm voice, backed by truth, can echo louder than a room full of titles. Some stories don't need explosions to make noise. Sometimes the loudest moment is when a teenager in beat-up sneakers proves that intelligence doesn't come with a dress code, and justice doesn't belong only to those in suits. Jalen Prescott didn't walk into that courtroom looking like anyone's idea of a hero. He didn't have the tailored suit, the prestigious degree, or the booming voice of a seasoned attorney. But he walked out with something far more powerful than approval. He walked out with proof. Proof that knowledge can shake a system, that preparation beats perception, and that when you stand up for someone else, even when you're underestimated, disrespected, and talked down to, you can make people see what they've ignored for years. Judge Wexler saw it. The courtroom saw it. And if we're paying attention, we should see it too. Because every neighborhood has a Jalen, some quiet kid in the back of the room, some kid who watches more than he talks, who reads, listens, and remembers everything. But the world keeps trying to tell him to sit down, to stay in his lane, to wait his turn. What if he didn't? What if we actually made space for voices like his before they had to fight their way in?